throwaway because my family knows my name. I'm 32, male, and if you ran into me at a coffee shop you'd never guess I grew up feeling itemized. I own a small data consultancy, 2 employees, a roster of boring but profitable clients, and a bookkeeper who keeps trying to convince me to stop reconciling receipts at 2 a.m. I have a modest condo with floor-to-ceiling windows, a plant that refuses to die, and a desk that faces east so the first thing I see every morning is clean light. I jog, I meal prep, I transfer a chunk to investments every month. By most metrics, I'm doing well. People assume I'm calm because I'm disciplined. The truth is, discipline is just how I make the noise shut up. I grew up in a house where love had line items and gratitude had an interest rate. My parents weren't monsters in the movie sense. They paid the mortgage, they packed lunches, they came to school plays. And every single act came with a receipt, real or imagined. Don't forget what we do for you, my mom would say, sliding a plate of spaghetti across the table like she was handing me an invoice. My dad would smile without looking up from the news and add, "That roof doesn't pay for itself." It started early. I vividly remember being 6 and wanting a book from the Scholastic catalog. It was one of those color pages where the dog-eared corners meant, "Please." I circled a paperback about volcanoes. At dinner, I asked if I could order it. My mom put her fork down and tilted her head the way you tilt a plant to see if it needs water. "And who's going to pay for that?" she asked. I didn't know. I said, "You," because I was 6. She laughed. "Oh, so we're made of money now?" My dad chimed in. "You think the lights turn on for free? You like watching your cartoons? That's electricity." I apologized for wanting a $4.99 book. They let me order it anyway. When it arrived, my mom handed it to me with a joking, "Add it to your tab." They laughed. I laughed because that's what you do when you don't understand the joke but know you're in it. It went from jokes to gentle reminders to commandments. After every school shopping trip. "We spent a lot today. You better take care of this stuff." After my braces tightenings. "That's thousands in your mouth right now. Smile for us." When I grew out of my scooter and wanted a used bike. "When you're older and have a job, you'll pay us back." It became a mantra, a refrain, and eventually a rhythm I learned to breathe in. Every object in my room hummed with it, the bed, the desk, the blanket. I learned the exact cost of my existence in their house, even if it was never printed out. Sometimes it was printed. Once, when I was 12, I walked into the kitchen after school to find a sheet of printer paper on the table covered in a grid. At the top my dad had written, "Household costs, annual," in all caps. The columns were labeled mortgage, utilities, groceries, insurance, gas, MISC. There were numbers, actual numbers, and a line at the bottom that said total, with a big circle. My mom saw me looking and pulled another sheet from the printer with a flourish. "See?" she said, friendly, conspiratorial. "People think money grows on trees." She tapped the total and whistled. "And that doesn't even include your school fund." My dad didn't look up but said, "So next time you think about leaving lights on, remember this number." It worked. I turned into a little auditor. I clicked lights off. I rinsed Ziplocs. I folded aluminum foil. I dragged the kitchen chair to reach the thermostat if I felt daring. If my shoes got muddy, I panicked about the paper towels. When my friends would linger at our door after walking me home, I would hustle inside because extra mouths meant extra snacks and extra snacks were a debit. I learned to say, "No, I'm not hungry," while my stomach vibrated like a loose drawer. The ledger tightened around everything, including praise. I remember a parent-teacher conference where my homeroom teacher, Mrs. Rowan, told my parents I was doing well in math and reading above grade level. Mrs. Rowan had this loose scarf that kept sliding down her shoulder, and she tugged it up every time she got excited about something I'd written. She said I was curious. My mom's smile had a weight to it. "He should be," she said. "We paid for that summer camp, didn't we?" On the drive home, my dad said, "Remember how much that camp cost?" I nodded, though I didn't. "We expect results." I felt pride, then shame at feeling pride, like I'd stolen it from a drawer with a price tag I could never afford. Sometimes love was explicit transaction. Birthdays came with speeches. "We didn't have this growing up," Mom would say as she lit candles. "We didn't get gifts for no reason." Dad would nod solemnly. "Be grateful." One year when I was 14, I asked if I could invite 2 friends over for pizza and video games. My mom was wiping counters and said, without looking up, "Are their parents chipping in?" I said, "I don't know." She said, "Why should we pay to feed other people's kids?" My dad laughed, then pretended to be serious. "Maybe we should send their parents a bill." We ordered 1 large instead of 2 mediums. My friends ate quietly and left early. I spent the rest of the night scraping cheese off the box so I wouldn't waste it. They were not always cruel. That's important to say, even if I'm not trying to make a case here. They showed up. They drove me to the doctor when I broke my wrist. They stood in the cold during soccer tournaments and bought hot chocolate on the way home. And in the car, with my hands thawing around the styrofoam cup, my mom would say, "We're always there for you, aren't we? That's what family is. One day you'll understand what we sacrificed." My dad would add, "You'll pay it back when you're successful. It all evens out." When I got my first job, stocking shelves at a drugstore at 16, my parents congratulated me like I'd been elected to Congress. "Now you're starting to pull your weight," Dad said, clapping my shoulder hard enough to make the bottle of vitamins I was holding pop like a knuckle. My mom asked for my schedule and taped it to the fridge under a magnet shaped like a tomato. On payday, I brought home my first paper check, smooth and white and thrilling. I sat at the table to endorse it and felt adult. Mom sliced it from my fingers with a practiced motion. "We'll deposit it for you," she said. "You don't know what you're doing yet." She set it under a dictionary and made a note on a pad, date, amount. "We'll keep track so you know how much you owe us is getting smaller." I must have looked confused because she softened. "Not oh, honey. It's just fair." The first time I said the words, "I don't want to owe you," my mom's face did something complicated. It was after a fight about a school trip. The class was going to D.C. for a weekend, and it cost $275. I wanted to go. Everyone was going. I could feel the desire like a physical burn under my skin. Dad laid the brochure flat on the table and smoothed it like it might reveal a discount if he ironed it hard enough. "That's a lot," Mom said. "What do we get out of it?" She meant experiences, memories, but the phrasing lodged. I'd saved $90 from my job by then. I offered it up, palms open. Dad shook his head. "We shouldn't have to take your money," Mom said. "But we always pay for everything." The ledger hung in the room like a chandelier about to fall. I heard myself say, "I don't want to owe you." Silence. Then my mom put a hand to her chest like I'd insulted her cooking. "We're your parents," she said, voice small and sharp at the same time. "You can't talk to us like we're creditors." My dad scoffed. "We are creditors," he said, half joking. "0 interest. For now." I didn't go to D.C. I told my friends my family was going to visit an aunt. I spent the weekend stocking vitamins and staring at the travel-size shampoo aisle, wondering about tiny versions of things. When I got home each night, my dad would be at the table with a calculator and a pen, paying bills. He'd scribble numbers in the margins of envelopes. "You'll understand someday," he said without looking up. "You'll sit at your own table and go, 'Damn, my parents were right.'" I learned to anticipate the asks. "What do we say?" My mom would prompt any time I opened the fridge, and I'd reply on cue, "Thank you for the roof over my head." It became theater. In front of relatives, we did a longer version. Aunt Pauline would ask how school was, and my mom would beam. "He's doing so well. We put so much into his education." Aunt Pauline would sigh. "Kids don't appreciate it these days." I'd perform. "I appreciate it. I'll pay you back someday." Everyone would laugh like I was adorable. I laughed too, and the laughter felt like swallowing a dry pill tilted sideways. If I slipped, if I was sullen, if I dared to ask for something without prefacing it with a speech about gratitude, my dad's eyes would go cool. "You think we owe you?" he'd say. "Because newsflash, kid, parents don't owe kids anything past the basics." Mom would add, "And even that is a lot." She had a way of framing parenting as volunteer work she'd been roped into. "We could have been traveling. We could have had fun." She'd say it with a smile, like a joke, but jokes wear grooves. It's funny, the phrases that become lint in your pockets. Add it to your tab. When you're older, we expect results. Be grateful. We pay for everything. They lived in my mouth so long that when I started dating in college, the first time a girlfriend brought me soup when I was sick, I asked how much I owed her. She laughed, then saw my face and said, "Nothing." I felt suddenly exhausted. I'm telling this all out of order because that's how it sits in me, stacked, messy, like a junk drawer you're afraid to open because everything is spring-loaded. But here's the headline. I grew up being told I owed. Debt was the language of love. Payment was the grammar of belonging. And I believed them. Of course I did. When you're a kid, your parents are gravity. You don't argue with the ground. People will ask why I didn't cut them off sooner. In a way, I did, in small, private rebellions. I started keeping my own little notebooks in high school, hours worked, pay received, what I spent on bus fare and lunch, my grades, the exact minutes I spent studying. It was my way of playing defense. If love was an audit, I would survive the audit. I'd be unassailable. I deserve to exist. I know this reads heavy. It felt heavy. There were good days, late summer nights when the laundry smelled like sunshine and my dad grilled corn and my mom let me have the first jar ear. But the ledger never left the table. It sat between us even when we laughed. I became good at squeezing myself smaller to fit around it. Now, when people ask me what I do, I say I solve problems. In truth, I tally. I run numbers until they make sense. I make debt behave. And this year, sitting at my own table with my own calculator and my bookkeeper texting me to please stop annotating bank memos, I realized something quietly monstrous. They had asked for payment for raising me, and I had become the kind of man who could pay. That realization didn't feel like anger. It felt like a door clicking into place. But before I tell you about that, you need to understand the house where I love you always had a subtotal. You need to understand the night my mom stood in my doorway holding a bag from the pharmacy and said, "These antibiotics were $18.99, don't forget." The way my dad would hand me a ride to practice with. Gas isn't cheap. The way I learned to say, "Thank you," and mean it, and also file it away like a debt coming due. You need to understand that leaving didn't feel like escape at first. It felt like theft. When I finally did leave, I took nothing I didn't buy with my own money. But I'm getting ahead of myself. That's part 2. For now, this is the beginning. I'm 32, I'm fine, and my childhood had a balance sheet. And for once in my life, I'm the one who gets to close the books. I left at 18 with 2 trash bags, a backpack, and a promise to myself, nothing that left that house would be something they could claim. I stood in my room on a sticky June evening and went shelf by shelf like a museum curator. The bike? They bought it. The desk? A hand-me-down from Dad's office. The comforter? Christmas gift, therefore a line item with a story attached. I folded my thrift store hoodies, the sneakers I bought with pharmacy paychecks, my notebooks with columns for hours, pay, bus fare. I took a paperback I'd found free on a community corkboard because I had pinned the flyer myself. I left the soccer trophies to dust. I didn't slam doors. I didn't announce. I just told them I got a room across town near the bus line and the community college, and that I'd be gone by Sunday. My mom blinked like I'd switched the TV input without asking. "You don't have to be dramatic," she said, instantly positioning herself as the reasonable one in an argument I hadn't started. My dad didn't look up from his emails. "Just remember," he said, "food isn't free out there. Heat isn't free. You're going to find out real fast what we've been shielding you from." I nodded. I was terrified. That didn't make him wrong. The room was 10 by 12 in a creaky Victorian that had been subdivided into too many lives. The landlord, a guy named Hal with a mustache that could hold soup, handed me a key and said, "No parties, no pets, cash is king." The carpet was the color of tea with too much milk. The window stuck. The radiator made a sound like distant applause. I could see the grocery store's neon sign from the sidewalk, Marco's, red letters that buzzed when it rained. I bought a plunger, a shower caddy, 2 bowls from the thrift store that didn't match, and a cheap French press because making coffee felt like dignity. The first morning, I poured too much and watched it bloom over the side and puddle into the ring in the wood. I wiped it up with toilet paper. My job was at the same drugstore. Sandy, my manager, had a voice like gravel in a jar and a heart that she pretended was smaller than it was. "Keep your drawer tight," she said on my first opening shift, sliding me a roll of quarters like it was contraband. "Don't let customers see you shake." I learned to count back change like a magician, each coin a small clink of competence. Night shifts smelled like floor cleaner, and the ghost of detergent aisle samples. I stocked end caps, zoned the makeup shelves, carried cases of water, and learned to carry 2 at a time. My knees hurt. My back hurt. Weirdly, the hurt was clean. It belonged to me. At the register, people told me their entire lives in the time it took to scan a basket. My husband's back on Percocet. A woman whispered over a bag of cotton balls. A man in a suit said, "Do you think this shade is right?" and handed me nail polish the color of a stop sign. I smiled a lot. I said, "Have a good night." Like a spell, I wanted to work. When I closed, I walked home with my backpack straps digging into my shoulders and the streetlights turning everything into stages. I air-dried my socks on the radiator and fell asleep to the heat ticking. Some nights, I dreamed my mom was at the end of my bed holding receipts. They called often. The first week, my dad's name lit up my flip phone while I was on break inhaling a 99-cent burrito. "How's adulting?" he said, jaunty, like a YouTube dad. I said, "It's fine." With my mouth full so I wouldn't say, "It's loud and lonely and I hate the smell in the hallway." He cleared his throat. "Well, you should start thinking about sending something home. You know, to help with groceries. Since we carried you for 18 years. I stared at the employee-only sign like it might give me a line to read. "I pay rent," I said. "I pay for my bus pass." He sighed like I was making him quote himself. "Nobody's saying you don't. We're saying, don't forget the people who got you there." The thing about debt as a language is you start translating even love into invoices. Community college was my lifeline. I enrolled because the building had air conditioning and a library that felt like church without the guilt. I took math, comp, intro to programming in a lab that hummed. The first time I wrote a line of code that made a little window print. "Hello?" I felt the same click I feel when a lid fits a jar. It wasn't romance. It was competence wearing truth like a well-fitting shirt. An advisor named Ms. Butcher called me kiddo once and then apologized like she'd broken some boundary. "You're working 40 hours and taking 4 classes?" she asked, peering over her glasses. "You can't run on fumes forever." I said, "I've been doing it since I was 6. She didn't laugh. I lived on canned tuna and rice in a pot with a dented lid. My roommates were mostly other almost adults, guys and girls with sagging mattresses and jobs in kitchens or daycare, hairnets hanging from hooks like resigned jellyfish. We bartered. I'd fix someone's Excel sheet, they'd give me rides when it snowed. One night the hot water went out, and we boiled pots on the stove and poured them into a plastic bin to make a patchwork bath. We talked about everything and nothing. Jose, who worked at a taqueria, said, "You ever think you're going to look back and laugh?" I said, "I think I'm going to look back and sleep." Receipts piled up in a shoebox, bus passes, notebooks, grocery runs where I bought bruised bananas because they were cheaper. I kept them like talismans, proof I could survive the audit. When my mom asked, "Are you eating?" I said yes. When she said, "You're welcome for teaching you frugality," I swallowed the reply that frugality learned at the tip of a gilt spear isn't a virtue, it's a reflex. Once, I tried to explain. "I feel like I'm always paying," I said, nervy and tired, my phone warm against my ear. She was quiet long enough that I thought maybe we'd gotten somewhere. Then she said softly, "We gave you life. You can't argue with a God who believes they created you out of generosity." I scraped by and then something shifted. In my second year, a professor asked if anyone wanted to help clean a dataset for a local nonprofit. Hours, volunteer numbers, survey responses no one knew what to do with. It sounded like free labor. It was. But it also sounded like a door. I stayed late with headphones on, learning VLOOKUPs and conditional formatting like I was learning a new alphabet. I wrote my first little Python script the same week I learned how to make beans good with onion and salt. Patterns emerged. I liked making messy things give up their secrets. My parents assumed any progress was evidence their system worked. When I told them I'd gotten a paid internship, $13 an hour felt like a windfall, Mom said. "All those years of us instilling work ethic." Dad said, "So when do we see dividends?" He meant it as a joke. That's the thing, there was always plausible deniability. If I called it out, I was humorless. If I let it go, it calcified into normal. I got better at not calling. I moved apartments, same city, different smell. The second place had roaches and a neighbor who sang at night in a wavering soprano that made me think of bowls on the edge of counters. I bought a rail bed frame with money I earned and assembled it myself with a hex key that chewed up my fingers. I started waking up without the ledger in my throat. The day I realized I'd gone a whole morning without calculating the price of the sun on my floor, I felt suspicious, like a loud car had passed and I somehow hadn't flinched. The internship turned into part-time, then into a job that was mostly spreadsheets and occasionally magic. I learned to present. I learned that if you put the good chart second, people assume you have more where that came from. I learned to breathe before answering questions so I didn't sound like a kid asking for permission. My boss, May, who wore sneakers to meetings like a dare, said, "You have a clean brain." I wrote it on a sticky note and put it on my monitor because no one had ever described my mind without a bill attached. Money remained tight, but it started to be a tool instead of a tally of sin. I opened a savings account and named it Runway, because emergency fund felt like a self-fulfilling prophecy. I let myself buy the nicer coffee when I pulled 2 late nights in a row. The first time I tipped 20% without doing algebra in my head, I almost cried at a diner counter. Progress is invisible until it's not. The last big fight with my parents before the quiet happened on a Sunday. I'd skipped a visit, work, laundry, catching up on a project. Mom called. "We haven't seen you in weeks," she said, lacing the sentence with sadness like a beaded dress. "We miss you." Then, also, the car needs new tires. It would be nice if you could contribute. After all the rides we gave you. My scalp went hot. I walked to the window and looked at the grocery sign. "No," I said. "Just that." The pause was an organism. "Excuse me?" my dad said somewhere in the room, background voice turned foreground. "No," I repeated, testing it for defects. "I'm not your kid credit line." He laughed once sharp. "Wow. We raised a selfish one." My mom said, "We just thought you were grateful." The call ended in static and old scripts. We didn't talk for a while after that. I didn't wither. The hunger I felt wasn't for their approval, it was for quiet. In the quiet I worked. I built a website. I took on a freelance project cleaning up an e-commerce inventory for a guy named Arjun who paid on time and said, "Please," in emails. My world got bigger by increments. A co-worker's potluck where people brought food that tasted like whole childhoods, a late train home where a kid showed me a magic trick, the morning I jogged past the yard sale and bought a framed print of a lighthouse because I wanted something that didn't feel borrowed. There's a superstition in me that says if you tell the good part too loud, it evaporates. But this isn't bragging, it's context. I went from counting pennies to counting projects. I didn't get rich overnight. I got steady. And once I was steady, I could finally look back without falling in. That's when the idea that had always been a threat started to feel like a plan. "Pay us back," they used to say. "When you're successful." I stood in my own kitchen, in my own apartment that smelled like cumin and clean coffee filters, and thought, what if I do? Not the way they meant, gratitude in installments, access in exchange for tribute, but literal, exact, down to the cent. What if I take their language and bankrupt it by being precise? The thought didn't feel like spite. It felt like math. It felt like standing up straight after years of stooping under a number I couldn't see. I washed my mug, set it on the rack, and made a new notebook. On the cover, in block letters, I wrote, "Audit." The notebook marked audit sat on my desk for a week before I had the nerve to open it. I'd glance at it while brushing my teeth or half watching Netflix, feeling the old tightness in my chest. Part of me thought writing anything in there would mean I'd become exactly what they said I was, obsessed with money, calculating, transactional. But then I remembered, that wasn't me, that was them. I was just finally putting numbers to a ghost they'd hung around my neck for decades. The first page was blank for 2 days. On the third I wrote one word, housing. Then underlined it. I started with the basics. I pulled up public records for our old address, mortgage histories, county tax assessments, property values. It was easier than I thought. The internet held the receipts my parents had always waved like a weapon but never shared. From there, I looked up average utility bills for a family of 3 during the years I lived at home. I scoured government statistics, consumer reports, inflation calculators. I even found a digitized ad circular from the local paper listing the price of milk in 1998. It felt clinical, almost boring, until I realized I was reconstructing my childhood in numbers, but on my terms. Rent equivalent, check. Food costs, check. Health insurance premiums during the years they covered me. Check. I created categories like I was designing a research project: housing, food, healthcare, education, miscellaneous. I was ruthless about it. If they'd guilt me with something, I found the market value. I didn't inflate. I didn't round up. In fact, I intentionally erred on the side of minimizing. They had always exaggerated. That meal was $50, when it was closer to 20. So I did the opposite. I cross-referenced, discounted, shaved off. I wasn't looking for revenge in the form of interest. I was looking for the cleanest, most defensible number possible. If anyone, even a stranger, looked at my math, they'd nod and say, "Yeah, that's reasonable." There were parts that stung. Writing down braces, $3,500, was like reopening the memory of my mom joking at every orthodontist visit, "Smile big, those are thousands in your mouth." I added braces to the healthcare column and moved on. Field trip I didn't go on? 0, because they never paid it. Shoes from the clearance rack? I logged a conservative yearly clothing allowance from USDA child rearing data. They'd said that's money on your feet every time I laced them. So fine, into the ledger it went. I spent nights at my laptop, numbers glowing like tiny truths. Some nights I laughed bitterly, muttering to myself like a crazy person. Oh, so the antibiotics were $18.99? Let me put that right here in healthcare, Mom. Other nights I went quiet, staring at totals that looked like small fortunes to a child but now, to me, were manageable. That was the strangest realization. The mountain they made me feel crushed under was, in reality, just a hill. Not small, not trivial, but climbable. Survivable. Payable. The act of calculating became almost soothing. It stripped the emotion from memories that had always burned. The night I asked for that D.C. trip and got told, "What do we get out of it?" used to make me angry. Now, in the ledger, it became a simple zero, a non-expense. Their refusal had no more weight than a blank cell in Excel. It was like pulling teeth from a monster and finding they were rubber. By month 3, I had a full draft of the parenting balance sheet. It was absurdly detailed, 22 years of costs, averaged and adjusted for inflation. Subtotals by category, annual breakdowns, a final number at the bottom. I looked at it and felt my throat loosen. There it was. The debt they'd held over me. The figure they'd kept abstract so it could grow monstrous in the dark. On my page, it was finite. It was a line item I could highlight, copy, paste, transfer. The total, $84,792. 16, not cheap. Not nothing. But not infinite either. Less than the sum of shame I'd been forced to carry. During this process, my parents kept orbiting. A text here. Hope you're remembering who paid for those nice teeth. A voicemail there, Dad's voice, clipped and casual. It'd be nice if you helped out with the water bill this month. I didn't respond much. Just enough to keep the silence from exploding. But each time they reached for that old script, I'd glance at my notebook and think, it's already accounted for. I worked like a man possessed. My consulting contracts grew. Data cleanup turned into analytics. Analytics turned into strategy. Clients paid. I paid my rent, paid my bills, paid my student loans early. Every payment I made in my own life made their imaginary debt feel smaller. For the first time, I was choosing where my money went. I tipped generously. I donated to mutual aid funds. I covered lunch for coworkers without announcing it. Love as transaction had warped me. Reclaiming transaction as generosity untwisted something inside. I didn't tell anyone about the notebook at first. It felt too obsessive, too strange. But one night, sitting on my couch with my friend Maya, who'd been through her own brand of family guilt, I let it slip. "I'm calculating what my parents spent on me," I said, half expecting her to laugh. She didn't. She sipped her tea and said, "That actually makes sense. They turned love into math. You're just finishing the equation." That sentence stuck with me for weeks. Finishing the equation. Closure not as forgiveness, not as confrontation, but as math. The hardest part wasn't the numbers. It was planning the delivery. How do you end a lifetime-long ledger? Do you mail a check? Write a letter? Show up in person and slap a folder on the table like a courtroom exhibit? I daydreamed every scenario. Some were petty, me sliding a bank transfer receipt across the table at Thanksgiving and walking out before dessert. Some were dramatic, standing on their porch with an envelope stamped "Paid in full." But the fantasy that felt right, the one that kept me calm at night, was clean and bloodless. No arguments. No chance for them to twist it into another guilt trip. Just a transfer of funds, exact to the cent, with a note. Then silence. Block. Exit. Ledger closed. That meant one more step, saving the full amount, liquid, untouched, ready. I didn't want to pull from investments or credit. I wanted it available in cash equivalent form, like a scalpel ready to cut. So I built a sub-account, nicknamed it Debt Repayment, and auto-transferred a percentage of every invoice. Watching it grow was like watching a storm gather offshore. Not scary, not thrilling, just inevitable. When the balance finally hit $84,792.16, I sat staring at the screen. The number looked both massive and fragile, like glassware on a shelf. It was mine, all mine. And yet I was about to give it away. Not out of obligation, not out of love, but out of strategy. Out of a desire to never again have to hear "you owe us." Because after the transfer, the only possible answer would be, "No, I don't." I thought I'd feel giddy. Instead, I felt calm. My parents had spent my entire life demanding repayment. I was going to give them exactly what they asked for, nothing more, nothing less. No interest, no extras, no forgiveness, no continued access. Just debt repaid, ledger balanced, accounts closed. And maybe that was the real revenge, not cruelty, not spectacle, but precision. The kid who once stood in the kitchen staring at a homemade spreadsheet of household costs had grown into a man with a better spreadsheet. And soon, I'd put it to its final use. But first, I had to draft the message. The note that would be the period at the end of the longest sentence of my life. The night I sat down to draft the message, my apartment was almost too quiet. It was one of those evenings when the city hum outside feels far away, like someone turned down the volume. I opened my laptop, logged into my bank account, and hovered over the Transfer Funds tab. My cursor blinked like it was impatient. All I had to do was type, click, and it would be done. But the note mattered. The note would be the difference between this being just another money exchange and this being the final act in a decades-long play. I opened a blank document and stared at it like it was a mirror. At first, I tried to write paragraphs. Something like, "For years you told me I owed you for raising me. You kept a running tally. You turned my childhood into a ledger. I've now calculated what that debt amounts to, and I am paying it in full." I deleted it. Too wordy. Too emotional. Anything longer than a sentence gave them openings, phrases they could latch onto, twist, or counter. I tried again. "Here is what you asked for. We're even now." Deleted. Another draft. "You said I'd pay you back someday. Consider this the repayment. Don't contact me again." Deleted. Then, as if I'd been circling the answer all along, it came, "Debt repaid." 2 words. Cold, factual, absolute. It was the kind of phrase my dad would have scribbled on an envelope margin while balancing bills. It was their language stripped down to its bones. No emotion. No explanation. Just transaction completed. I practiced typing it into the memo field of the transfer page. It looked almost laughably small there, like graffiti scrawled on a skyscraper. But it was perfect. I didn't do it right away. For 3 weeks I carried the knowledge in my chest like a coin I hadn't spent. I went about my days as usual, client meetings, gym, quiet dinners, but with a private electricity running under everything. I think I was testing myself. Did I want this out of anger or out of finality? Every time I asked, the answer was the same. I didn't feel hot or vengeful. I felt precise. Ready. During those weeks, my parents reached out more than usual, as if some subconscious thread connected us. My mom texted a photo of a casserole she'd made, captioned, "Remember how much you love this? You should come visit." My dad called and left a voicemail. "Gas prices are insane. You remember how much we spent driving you around all those years?" The timing was uncanny. Each little nudge felt like the universe reminding me why the notebook existed. The last straw came when Mom emailed me an article titled, "Adult Children Have a Duty to Care for Aging Parents." No context. No greeting. Just a link and her signature. I read it, closed my laptop, and thought, enough. It's time. On a Tuesday morning, nothing special, just a day between others, I brewed coffee, sat at my desk, and opened the bank transfer screen. I'd already saved their account info years back, from the time they needed me to wire them money for a car repair when I was 22. I'd sent $300 then and lived off peanut butter for the rest of the month. They'd never paid it back. That was fine. After today, nothing would be outstanding. I entered the amount, $84,792. 16. The number filled the box like a stone dropped into water. Memo line, debt repaid. I stared at it for a full minute. My heart wasn't racing. My palms weren't sweaty. I just felt a steady thrum, the same rhythm I feel when I finish reconciling a project budget. Click. Confirm. Transfer complete. A confirmation screen popped up with the date, time, and transaction number. I screenshotted it and saved it in a folder labeled Closed. Then I logged out, stood up, and poured myself another cup of coffee. The world outside my window was unchanged. Buses rumbling, someone walking their dog, the hum of life, but inside me something had shifted. The ledger was closed. Blocking them was easier than I expected. Phone block. Email, filter to trash. Social media, remove, block, restrict. I even dug into LinkedIn to make sure they couldn't peek there. Each click felt like tying off a string that had been dangling loose for years. When I was finished, I sat back and felt light. Not euphoric, not dramatic. Just light, like a heavy jacket had finally been taken off. For the first time in my life, the thought of them couldn't reach me. There would be no follow-up demand, no guilt-laced call, no message reminding me of the roof over my head. The game was over, and I had ended it on my terms. Of course, part of me wondered how they reacted when they saw the deposit. I pictured my mom opening her banking app in the morning while sipping coffee, eyes widening. My dad squinting at the screen, maybe thinking it was a mistake. Then reading the memo line. Debt repaid. I could see the silence that would fall across the table, the way their whole narrative about me, ungrateful, selfish, forever indebted, would crack. Maybe they'd feel triumphant at first. Look, he finally paid us back. But the triumph would sour when they realized what else was missing. No note of love, no promise of visits, no ongoing access. Just the money. Exactly what they'd demanded, and nothing more. I didn't need to witness it. The beauty of precision revenge is that it works without applause. The strangest part came in the days after. I expected to feel guilt. 32 years of conditioning doesn't vanish overnight. But the guilt didn't come. Instead, I felt a growing calm, like my nervous system was finally being allowed to idle. I'd wake up, make coffee, and not immediately calculate what I owed the world for existing. My mind felt spacious. I found myself reflecting on small moments differently. That Scholastic book I circled at 6 years old? For years the memory had burned with shame. Now, I thought, it cost $4.99. That's in the ledger. It's paid. The braces, the groceries, the hot chocolate after soccer? Logged, tallied, settled. The memories softened once the debt was stripped out of them. They became just memories, not invoices. One evening, while cleaning, I stumbled across the original audit notebook. I flipped through the pages, my neat handwriting, the columns, the totals. For a moment I considered shredding it. But instead I closed it gently and slid it onto a shelf. Not as evidence, not as a weapon, but as a record of survival. Proof that I could turn their language of debt into my language of closure. It's hard to explain the peace that comes when you realize you don't owe anyone for existing. For so long, I thought freedom would come from escaping, from running as far as possible. But escape is just distance. Closure is finality. And that's what I bought for $84,792. 16. Not their approval. Not reconciliation. Not revenge in the cinematic sense. Just silence. Clean, quiet silence. And in that silence, for the first time, I could hear my own voice clearly. Not saying, "Thank you for the roof over my head." Not promising to pay it back someday. Just my own voice, unencumbered, saying, "I'm done." But the story doesn't end with the transfer. The aftermath had its own weight, its own strange liberation. Because closing the ledger didn't just free me from them. It forced me to confront who I was without the constant shadow of debt. That's where things really began to change. The first morning after the transfer, I expected to wake with the same tight knot in my chest I'd carried since childhood. That knot had been my alarm clock, my metronome, the thing that reminded me every single day that I was behind, deficient, owing. Instead, I woke to stillness. The light through the curtains looked the same, the hum of the radiator was the same, but my body felt different. It was as though some background program had finally finished running, freeing up space in my head I hadn't realized was occupied. For the first time, I didn't immediately calculate the cost of existing that day. I didn't think about bus fares, electric bills, or the running total of what my parents had supposedly spent on me. The thought just didn't arrive. The quiet was disorienting at first. Imagine living next to train tracks your entire life, and one day the trains stop. The silence is startling. You keep listening for the rumble, the whistle, the vibration in your bones, but nothing comes. In that quiet, new questions rose. Who am I without the ledger? What do I do with the mental space where guilt used to live? The first answer surprised me. I rest. I let myself rest without the weight of earning it. I lounged on my couch with a paperback, bought new, full price, no shame attached, and didn't once think about how much it cost or whether I deserved it. I went to a diner and ordered pancakes with extra blueberries, tipping 25% just because I could. I caught myself smiling at the absurdity. Pancakes as liberation. A week passed. No messages from my parents, at least not ones that got through. Maybe they tried calling from different numbers or sending emails to old addresses. If they did, I didn't see them. The blocks held. Part of me half expected someone else in the family, an aunt, a cousin, to reach out, carrying their message like a courier pigeon. But no one did. The silence expanded, clean and undisturbed. That's when it hit me. I had always been afraid that cutting ties meant confrontation, endless justifications, shouting matches. But the beauty of money, the same tool they'd used against me, was that it made things simple. Paid. Settled. Nothing left to argue. Around the 2-week mark, I noticed my work change too. I'd always been good at my job, but part of me had worked with a chip on my shoulder, an endless drive to prove I was worth the cost of raising me. My parents' voices whispered in every client call, "We expect results. Don't waste what we gave you." Without that voice, I approached projects differently. Not with desperation, but with curiosity. Meetings felt lighter. I asked more questions, pitched bolder ideas. My clients noticed. "You seem more confident lately," one said. "Relaxed even." They didn't know it, but they were witnessing what happens when a man finally puts down a burden he carried since childhood. There were moments of grief too, though I didn't expect them. Not grief for losing my parents. That relationship had been gone long before I hit confirm on the transfer, but grief for the version of myself that had lived so long in debt. I'd walk past a toy store and think of 6-year-old me with the Scholastic catalog, circling a book with hope and shame intertwined. I'd feel a pang for that kid who thought wanting a $4.99 paperback made him a criminal. One night, I even dreamed of him, me, small, sitting cross-legged on my bedroom floor with a pile of Monopoly money, trying to sort it into piles labeled roof, food, love. I knelt beside him in the dream, took the fake bills out of his hands and said, "You're paid up, kid. Go play." He looked at me like I'd spoken magic. I woke up with tears on my face. Not sad tears. Relief. Friends started to notice changes I hadn't put words to yet. Maya, the one I told about the audit notebook, raised an eyebrow one evening when we were out for drinks. "You seem lighter," she said. "Like you're not waiting for the other shoe to drop." I laughed, because she was right. "That's because I bought the damned shoes," I said, and we both cracked up. For years, humor had been my defense, a way to deflect the heaviness of my past. Now, it felt different. The laughter wasn't a mask, it was genuine. I kept expecting guilt to creep in, like a shadow returning when the sun shifts. But it didn't. Not even when I thought about holidays, birthdays, or the inevitable aging of my parents. Some part of me wondered if I'd get a call from a hospital one day, some nurse telling me they'd listed me as next of kin. The thought didn't send me into panic. I knew my answer would be simple. I already paid my debt. It sounds cold when I write it, but the truth is freeing. Because love isn't a transaction. And I'd spent decades mistaking invoices for affection. The biggest change came a month later, in a way I didn't expect. I'd always been cautious with relationships, terrified of being a burden. Every date, Every friendship came with a silent calculation. What do I owe them for liking me? How long until they demand repayment? But without that ledger whispering in my ear, I began to show up differently. When someone cooked me dinner, I didn't immediately think of what I owed in return. When a coworker offered help, I accepted without panic. Love and kindness began to feel like gifts instead of loans. For the first time, I believed in the possibility of unconditional care. One Saturday morning, I took the audit notebook off the shelf. I flipped to the last page where the total was scrawled, $84, $792.16, and traced it with my finger. Then I closed it and slid it into a box with old tax returns and utility bills. Not destroyed, not forgotten, just archived. That's what it was now, history. Not a living weight, not a daily reckoning. Just numbers on paper. Settled. I realized then that revenge wasn't the point. Revenge is hot, messy, loud. What I'd done was something colder, quieter, and ultimately more satisfying. I turned their weapon into my freedom. And in that freedom, a new thought began to take root. If I don't owe anyone for existing, then maybe I'm allowed to want more from life than survival. Maybe I can build something, love, joy, family, without ledger lines hanging over it. That thought scared me. But it also thrilled me. The transfer had ended one chapter. The next was just beginning. The transfer was supposed to be the end of the story, but the weeks that followed made me realize endings aren't clean, they ripple. At first, the ripples were invisible. Life went on. I woke, I worked, I ran errands. But small shifts started showing up in how I carried myself. For 32 years, every decision I made had been filtered through the question, what will they think? What will this cost me in their eyes? With that ledger erased, choices felt wider. I noticed it in the grocery store of all places. I was in the produce aisle staring at blueberries. Normally, I'd calculate, full price, out of season, not worth it. But that day I picked them up without hesitation. I didn't think about what my dad would have said or whether it was responsible. I just thought, I want blueberries. And I bought them. It was such a small act, but as I ate them later at home, one by one, it hit me, freedom wasn't dramatic. It was mundane. It was the quiet absence of guilt in tiny choices. Around that time, I got a letter. Not from my parents, they were blocked, but from my Aunt Pauline. It arrived in a cream envelope with looping cursive I recognized instantly. Inside. Your parents told me you sent them money. They're hurt that you cut contact. They feel blindsided. Families should talk, not exchange bank statements. Call your mother. She's heartbroken. For a moment, the old panic surged. The urge to explain, to defend, to write a 6-page essay justifying myself. That was how it had always gone. They'd send a messenger, and I'd scramble to prove I wasn't ungrateful. But this time I didn't. I folded the letter neatly, slid it back into the envelope, and placed it in the same box where the audit notebook lived. History, not obligation. I didn't call. That night, I sat with the silence that followed. It was heavy at first, then it softened. The silence wasn't emptiness, it was space. At work, the changes kept compounding. I got invited to speak on a panel about data ethics, something I would have declined before, too afraid of being exposed as not enough. But I said yes. Standing under the bright lights, microphone in hand, I told a roomful of strangers how data, when used without transparency, becomes a weapon. Even as I spoke, part of me knew I wasn't just talking about spreadsheets. I was talking about my childhood ledger, the hidden costs, the tally marks used to control me. And now, here I was, naming it out loud without shame. Afterward, someone approached me and said, "The way you talked about power and accountability, it hit hard." I smiled, realizing I'd finally turned my pain into something useful. Not everything was smooth. There were nights I lay awake, haunted by flashes of memory. My dad's voice, "We are your creditors. 0 interest, for now." My mom's voice, "We gave you life." In those moments, I'd feel the guilt claw at the edges of my mind, begging to be let back in. But I had a ritual for those nights. I'd get up, open the audit notebook, flip to the total, and whisper to myself, "Paid in full." It worked like a lullaby. I'd fall asleep again knowing the ghosts couldn't collect anymore. I didn't tell many people about the transfer. Only Maya knew the full story. But the funny thing about carrying less shame is that pieces of the truth slip out naturally. One evening over beers, a coworker was venting about his mom guilting him into paying for her vacation. He said, "She acts like I owe her for raising me." Before I could stop myself, I laughed, really laughed, and said, "Mine used to say the same thing. So I paid them back. Every cent. Then I blocked them." He stared at me, mouth open, then broke into a grin. "Holy shit. That's incredible." I shrugged. "It's peaceful." He clinked his glass against mine. "That's the coldest and smartest thing I've ever heard." I didn't feel cold. I felt steady. The longer the silence stretched, the more I realized that my parents had never really wanted repayment. Not literally. What they wanted was control. Keeping the debt vague and infinite was how they kept me tethered. By quantifying it and paying it, I destroyed the leash. And that was the most triumphant part. Not that I gave them money, but that I gave them no excuses left. Nothing to dangle, nothing to weaponize. The leash was gone. 3 months later, I got an unexpected email. It was from my dad. He must have created a new account to get past the block. The subject line, ungrateful. The body of the email was short. "So this is how you repay us? Cold, heartless. We gave you everything, and you send money like we're strangers. You'll regret this." I read it once, twice. My hands didn't shake. I didn't feel the old panic. Instead, I noticed the irony. He thought the money was insulting, when it was exactly what he'd always demanded. I didn't reply. I dragged it to trash. And for the first time in my life, I felt no need to explain myself. That's when I knew the revenge had truly worked. Not because I hurt them, but because I no longer needed their narrative. Their version of me, the indebted child, the selfish son, no longer existed. I wasn't escaping anymore. I was free. And in that freedom, new possibilities unfolded. What if I'd built a life where love wasn't alone? Where kindness didn't come with interest? Where relationships weren't ledgers to balance but connections to nurture? For the first time, I could imagine it. The transfer was the climax. But this quiet unfolding of a new life, was the real victory. It's been a year since I hit confirm on that transfer. A year since I typed 2 words, debt repaid, and closed the book on 32 years of wait. People talk about revenge like it's a fire, something that burns hot and leaves you standing in the ashes. But this wasn't fire. It was water. A clean wash. A quiet erasure. In that year, I built something I never thought possible, a life not defined by owing. It's not glamorous, not cinematic, just mine. I keep waiting for the guilt to return. For a long time, guilt was my native language. It was how I knew I belonged, how I tethered myself to family, how I measured worth. Without it, I thought I'd feel hollow. Instead, I feel spacious. There are moments I test it, like pressing on a bruise that used to hurt. I'll stand in a bookstore and let myself buy 3 paperbacks at once, remembering the 6-year-old me who was shamed for circling one. I'll order dessert without doing mental math. I'll accept kindness from a friend without scrambling to pay it back. And every time, the bruise is gone. My parents haven't broken the silence in months. After my dad's angry email, there was nothing. No calls, no letters through other relatives, no sudden appearances. Maybe they realized the game was over. Maybe they're sitting in their house, still spinning stories about me to anyone who'll listen. It doesn't matter. The most surprising part of all of this is that I don't hate them. I thought I would, once I finally cut the cord. I thought the anger would roar, that I'd fantasize about them reading the bank memo and choking on it. But hate requires energy, and I don't have any left to give them. What I feel instead is absence. A space where their voices used to echo, now filled with quiet. I used to think closure meant a dramatic confrontation, me shouting all the things I'd swallowed for decades while they finally understood. But I understand now, they were never going to understand. And that's okay. Closure didn't come from their recognition. It came from my action. People online sometimes ask, "Is it possible to go no contact with your parents and feel peace?" I never answer, but I think about it. The truth is yes. If you stop trying to make them different, if you stop waiting for the apology that will never arrive, if you cut the rope cleanly, peace is possible. For me, peace looked like a transfer receipt with a transaction number. I'd been thinking about that kid I used to be, the one folding aluminum foil and panicking about paper towels. The boy who stood in the kitchen staring at his father's household costs spreadsheet like it was scripture, I carried him with me for years, shoulders hunched, heart apologetic. Sometimes I imagine talking to him now. I'd tell him, "You don't owe them. You never did. They turned love into a bill, but that wasn't your fault. You get to grow up and write your own numbers. And one day, you'll pay it back, not because you have to, but because you choose to on your terms. And then, you'll walk away free." I think he'd cry. I think he'd finally unclench his fists, and believe me, my life now is simple, and that's its own triumph. My consultancy runs smoothly. I take vacations without guilt. I've started dating with a different kind of openness, one where I don't tally every kindness or brace for the invoice hidden in affection. I've even allowed myself to consider starting a family someday, not out of obligation, but out of choice. The thought scares me, but it doesn't paralyze me. Because I know now that love isn't a debt. Love is given, not loaned. And I'll never repeat the cycle I grew up in. Sometimes I pull out the audit notebook. I flip through the meticulous columns, the final total, the neat handwriting of a man who was determined to finish the equation. It doesn't sting anymore. It feels almost abstract, like looking at someone else's research project. Then I close it, slide it back into its box, and return to the life I built on the other side of it. Here's the thing. Revenge wasn't really the point. Revenge is about them. This was about me. About ending the script they wrote for me, about turning their language against them, about finding a way to stop carrying a burden that was never mine. The money is gone. They'll spend it however they want. Maybe they'll tell themselves it proves they were right all along, that I owed them. But the truth is simpler. I gave them exactly what they demanded, no more, no less. And in doing so, I made their debt meaningless. Because the real freedom isn't in paying. It's in walking away. So that's my story. I'm 32. I'm free. And sometimes the best closure you'll ever get is giving people exactly what they asked for, nothing more, and then disappearing into a life that is entirely, gloriously your own.